All right. Reverend Stepp, what role does faith play in this community?
Well, I would say it's a very significant role. This is a very religious place. There are lots of churches here. I don't know the exact stats or numbers, but my experience so far here in Franklin and Macon County has been that I think most people, I think a majority of people have some sort of religious affiliation. I started to say Christian because it is almost entirely Christian. There's a synagogue and a handful of Baha'i people from Baha'i, but it's mostly Christian. I think it obviously plays a role in people's personal lives. It's a way for them to find meaning and purpose to their life, a sense of belonging and community. It's I think in good and bad ways, it plays a role in civic life. So there's certainly a lot of sort of public prayer, sort of a public acknowledgement of religion, specifically Christianity, that probably makes folks here, I think, feel a certain unity. It creates a kind of binding force within the community that we all think of ourselves as people who believe in God and have a spiritual life. I'm not sure that it's as helpful maybe as sometimes people think it is. I think sometimes, not just here, but throughout the world in the human experience, religious belief and religious practice can sometimes be a little bit shallow, a little bit self-centered, and so it creates a veneer of homogeny. Oh yeah, we all believe in God. We're all Christians here. And then you go just a little bit below the surface and you start discovering that there can be actually very significant differences in what people think that means for themselves and for our community. And I think religion in this community is changing, just as it is all over the United States. As more people move in, as new generations grow up, I think church attendance is probably falling here, just as it is elsewhere in the United States. And I think it'd be very interesting to see in another generation what public role religion is playing. I think it will be different. I think it'll be diminished. But based on what I was saying just a moment ago about some of the ways that's illusory, it's sort of shallow at times, I'm not sure a diminished role of religion in community life here would necessarily be a bad thing.
While hoping for unity, there have been many divisions of the religious community in Franklin over the years. What do you think splits congregations up beyond differences in belief?
I would say it's most often relational frictions. So belief does sometimes play a part, as you acknowledged in your question, but actually, in my experience, historically, belief did play a very significant part. So the splitting between Roman Catholic and Protestant was very much about belief. There were also lots of other factors, as historians tell us. I think in the last century in the United States, belief has become a secondary or even tertiary, a third or fourth level cause of split. I think far more often it has to do with people who are unable to resolve relational friction, differences of opinion about not necessarily what they believe, but how to act out their religion, how the church should function. And that really can range from the trivial, like where these chairs should be placed. And it's sad to say that it can be that trivial, that churches will split over positioning of chairs or what color carpet you're going to have, up to much more significant things like how do we engage with society and government, how do we deal with serious issues in our community at the time. Those can split churches. So if I'm right that relational friction and an inability to resolve conflict and tension in relationships is a major factor, then that has all the roots you might imagine. Socioeconomic differences in families of origin and how people were raised and how they were trained, as it were, by their families and the communities of origin to deal with conflict, and, you know, politics, the whole 9 yards. So all religion, Christianity, it's always people trying to do the best they can. And so the whole range of everything that human beings do and can do comes in and becomes a factor.
Up until recently, the Episcopal congregations in Franklin were sharply divided on race. There was a white church and a black church on opposite ends of town. Why do you think that these churches stayed semi-segregated for so long?
Well, there would have been a lot of factors involved. Initially, the segregation was a function of both culture and law. So when these churches were founded in 1888, it would have been impossible for them to be integrated. It would have, you know, just been unthinkable to the people of the time and in the culture and in the context. And as the decades went by, you know, that was the cultural and legal factors were the main reasons. It's my understanding, I'm not a historian, but it's my understanding that in some ways segregation and racism really worsened in the early 20th century and sort of hardened some of these factors. Of course, by the 1960s, things were beginning to change, but rural communities like this are always on the tail end of change. So there would have been a slowness that comes from just a community culture that is slow to embrace change. The Episcopal Church itself has probably at least since the early 1900s, just as a denomination in the United States, has always had different forces and tension. So there's always been a strong progressive element in the Episcopal Church, going all the way back to the movement for labor rights and women's rights in the early 20th century. But the Episcopal Church's worship, its liturgy, the way we do what we do on Sunday morning is deeply conservative. There's aspects of our services and the way we do worship that have not changed since the Reformation. So we're going on 500 years now. And parts of our service would be recognizable to the English reformers of the 1500s. So that, by definition, I think, draws people who aren't necessarily interested in rapid change on any front. So that's always been a tension. There's always been this tension of Episcopalians who are quite progressive at times on social issues and politics, and then when we gather for worship, you know, we're quite conservative in the way we adapt our worship. Even very minor changes to our worship require as much as 6 to 12 years of national discussion to take place. So I say all that as a context for, you know, obviously I wasn't here when the walls of segregation began to come down in the 1960s, but one can imagine both an African American Episcopal community and a white Episcopal community, that while individuals within those communities might have been relatively progressive and interested in desegregation, they were also habituated to very slow change, to a very conservative approach to sort of to rocking the boat. It's not a church with a personality of, hey, let's just do the new thing. It's really it's a church with a personality of, well, let's see, let's give it a couple of decades, and if it really seems like the right thing, then we'll do it. Obviously, again, I wasn't here, but some of what I've just described, especially about worship, transcends racial, socioeconomic, and cultural boundaries, in the sense that our African American church would have been conservative in its worship, and our white church would have been conservative in its worship. In other words, individuals, regardless of their racial or socioeconomic or cultural background, would have been drawn into this kind of worship out of some desire for stability and continuity and not really being attracted to rapid change in all areas of their life. So it's very possible to imagine that the African American church would, even if members of that church might have been very active in the NAACP or very active in the progressive movement on civil rights, they might not have even themselves been necessarily pushing to do anything differently in terms of worshiping on Sunday morning. Now, as it happened, a very difficult relational conflict emerged in the white church, St. Agnes's here, in the late 1970s between them and their new priest, their new rector. And when so this particular priest had both churches, the white church and the black church. When the decision was made that he needed to stop being the priest at the white church because the conflict had become essentially unresolvable, he became just the priest at the black church. And a number of white members from the white church moved their membership to the black church. And that was the beginning of integration. And I know some of the folks who are a part of that early movement towards integration. And they are, and pretty much always their whole lives have been, very progressive in terms of social issues and politics. But it's interesting to note that it was not a progressive desire for racial integration, but something else that triggered the beginning of integration. And my understanding is that the African American church had to actually do some soul searching about that. Or after almost 100 years of being segregated, are we prepared? And it became a part of the tradition and the institutional memory of this church that an African American matriarch, an older woman who had been a member of that church, St. Cyprian's, the African American church for many years, in some conversation that took place there, she said, "This ain't no black church, this ain't no white church, this is God's church." And that became so ingrained into the institutional memory of this church that they emblazoned it on a banner. And that banner sits very close to the altar at St. Cyprian's. And when I first came here and began to talk to these folks about being their priest, that was a story they wanted to tell me right from the start. So if events that were not exactly related to integration itself set it in motion, but then it became something that they took ownership of. Integration is something we want to do.
Hang on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can only record 20 minutes at a time.
Oh, okay.
So I was